Welcome to KU Padasala. Today we will discuss the topic Indian fiction in English. We all know that novel is the most popular form of writing even today. Novel emerged in Europe in the 17th century with the publication of Don Quixote, which was published in 1605. It is true that there were several other narratives similar to the novel in the past, especially the medieval romances. In fact, novel emerged as a reaction to the medieval romances. When we trace the history of the storytelling, we will have to go back to the Decameron and the Canterbury Tales, and even the Vikramaditya stories, Jataka tales, and the Arabian Nights, etc. But we know that these are all narratives which cannot be put under the form or the title novel, because novel is different from all these narratives. And it is rightly said that novel emerged in the 17th century as a result of the social and political transformations that happened in Europe. The major transformation is industrialization and the emergence of middle class. So the emergence of novel has lot to do with the emergence of middle class, a literate middle class who can read and write. And in the novel, what we see is the expression of or the presentation of the life and experiences of the ordinary people, the middle class people. Unlike the romances where we find the adventures, the unrealistic adventures of the heroes, that is the lords, the kings, queens, etc. So unlike the romances, which is unrealistic, illusory, the novels provide a realistic presentation of actual experiences of life, and that too the life of ordinary people. So with the emergence of the novel, a new kind of thrust on an objective presentation of the real experiences of ordinary people began. And Ralph Fox, one of the important critics who studied the emergence of the novel, commented that novel is the most important contribution of the bourgeoisie to the modern world. So according to him, it is a contribution of the bourgeois renaissance, the emergence of the bourgeoisie that rejected the traditional feudal past. So it is with the emergence of the bourgeois class, the middle class, the enlightened middle class, that the novel also emerged. But in India, when we come to India, we find that the emergence of the novel in Indian languages as well as in English in the context of India emerged in connection with the transformations that the English education and the colonial rule has created in our society. Meenakshi Mukherjee, who studied about the novel, the emergence of the novel in India, who wrote the famous book Twice Born Fiction and another one Realism and Reality, comments that novel in India originated as a result of the interaction between the colonial culture, the Western culture, and the Indian traditional culture. So this interaction between the two cultures, the East and the West, produced the novel. When we speak about the interaction between the two cultures, it is important to note that in the traditional Indian culture, we didn't have any concept of the democratic or the kind of individualistic lifestyle, or the right of the individual has not been properly defined or focused in the traditional kind of Indian culture, because Indian culture was basically a feudal culture. It is very much influenced by the religious principles that emerged in the feudal period. And so, with the emergence of the bourgeois colonial culture in India, individualism began to emerge. The individuals began to assert their identity, their individuality, or the emergence of individualism in India began with the influence of the English language and the colonial influence, or we can say the Western influence. It is this individualism that resulted in the emergence of the novel. So when we look at novels in general, we find that in Malayalam also, in Indulekha is considered to be the first Malayalam novel. We know that Chandu Menon was very much influenced by the English writers, the English novelists, especially writers like Walter Scott, and Chandu Menon admits that fact in the introduction that he wrote to that novel. But it is also true that Indulekha, the novel, tries to present the transforming Indian society or Kerala society particularly. Just as Meenakshi Mukherjee refers, we find a conflict between the newly adopted, newly acquired value system and the traditional value systems. Indulekha, the English educated girl, is questioning the traditional value systems, the traditional system of marriage. She is asserting her individuality by deciding to marry her lover rather than an old Nambudiri, which was the practice of the traditional Nair families. So we find that Indulekha's assertion of her individuality, her identity, is a true depiction of or a reference to the emergence of individualism in our society. And that emerges mainly out of her association with the English language or education, for that modern education for that matter. So Chandu Menon's Indulekha certainly is the novel that refers to this social transformation, or we can say cultural transformation that was happening during this particular period, the colonial period. And that is true with majority of the early novels. And when we look at Indian English novels or novels written by Indians in English, we find that majority of these writers deal with topics related to the individuality, the identity, and the fight against traditional practices, etc., just like Indulekha. For example, if you look at the first novel, that is Rajmohan's Wife. Rajmohan's Wife, written by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. We find that Rajmohan's Wife, the first Indian novel in English, speaks about the life of a woman, a married woman, the pitiable life of a married woman, Madangini. So, similar to the Malayalam novel, that is Indulekha, Rajmohan's Wife also speaks about the individual experience of a woman. which was quite different from the depictions of women in the earlier Indian narratives. When we speak about the emergence of the novel in English, we will also have to refer to certain narratives like memoirs and sketches and even travelogues written by Indians in English. For example, Deen Muhammad has written a travelogue, and Venkata Boraya wrote a book, Account of Jains. Raja Ramohan Roy, who is considered to be the first Indian prose writer in English, he wrote a Defense of Theism that was published in 1817. And Behramji Malabari wrote two books. One is Gujarat and Gujaratis, published in 1882, and The Indian Eye and English Life, published in 1895. So there were several such writers who cannot be termed as novelists, but prose writers who attempted different forms of writing. And it is in this background that the novel emerged. And even before Bankim Chandra Chatterjee wrote Rajmohan's Wife, there were several other writers from Bengal itself, Kailash Chandra Dutt and Soshi Chandra Dutt and even Thoru Dutt. They were all prose writers. And Thoru Dutt also wrote a novel which is titled Bianca, but it was an unfinished novel. And it was Bankim Chandra Chatterjee who wrote a full-fledged novel which can be termed as a novel in English. And that is why we consider Bankim Chandra Chatterjee as the first novelist as far as Indian writing in English is concerned. And then we find that Kripabai Satyanathan is an important name, even though she wrote novels which are to a certain extent biographical also. They can be termed as biographical writings as well as novels. But the two novels that she wrote, Kamala, A Story of Hindu Wife, published in 1894, Saguna, A Story of Native Christian Life, published in 1885. Actually, Saguna is even more popular than the other book. And Kripabai Satyanathan is considered to be one of the earliest women writers in Indian English fiction. And all this shows that the early writers attempted to focus on the conflict that was happening in the field of culture as a result of the emergence of the new bourgeois middle class culture and the traditional Indian culture. The conflict was real, it was going on, and that is very much reflected in the writings of almost all these writers. And we find that T. Ramakrishna Pillai, who wrote Padmini, an Indian romance, published in 1903, A. Madhaviya, who wrote Satyanada, published in 1909, and Thillai Govindan, published in 1916, is also an important writer because he attempts to portray the East-West encounter, the kind of transformation that happened in the life of a man. He refers to a Brahmin young man as a result of English education, because he depicts a young man, a Brahmin youth who was Western educated and who come under the influence of the West, the influence of English language and the Western culture, and later rediscovers his faith in Hinduism. So this kind of conflict of cultures, the kind of confusion that existed at that time as a result of this conflict in the English educated youth is very well depicted in Madhaviya's novels as well. He also wrote another novel, Clarinda, which is a kind of a historical romance that speaks about a woman who converted to Christianity in Tanjavur. It is believed that it is based on a real experience, and Dr. Ramamurthy, an Indian critic in English, refers to a particular church in memoriam of Clarinda. So it is considered to be a real story, or the novel is based on a real story on a particular woman who converted to Christianity. So the 19th century, we find several such attempts to present Indian life in English language. Even then we find that the use of English to depict Indian experience certainly was a problem. That was an issue. How to use English? How can a reader accept an ordinary Indian villager speaking in English, faultless English? And that is something that was very difficult to understand, difficult to accept. But writers, more and more writers began to emerge, and we find a lot of writers coming up in the early part of 20th century. The 19th century saw the emergence of the novel in India, not only in English but in all Indian languages. In the 20th century, what we find is a transition in the preoccupations of the writers. The 19th century writers were mainly preoccupied with the cultural confrontation, the confusion that originated out of the conflict between the colonial Western culture and the traditional Indian culture, and the moral dilemma that they face out of the emergence of individualism and the democratic principles and the kind of modern awareness about identity, etc., as against the Indian traditional belief systems. But in the 20th century, the early part of 20th century, we find another kind of influence that is being portrayed by these writers, and that is the nationalism. We can say the influence of nationalism. It may be because by this time a kind of nationalist movement began to emerge in India. A desire for freedom was very much in the air at that time. The educated Indians began to protest against the colonial rule, and they started demanding freedom for India. We also find the emergence of Gandhi as a leader who can unite all kinds of people, people belonging to all religions, and people belonging to the south and the north and the west and the east. So the influence of Gandhi was very important, and that actually gave a direction to the movement for freedom. So the early part of 20th century, we find several novels emerging, and almost all these novels refers to the nationalist movement and the political struggle of the people against the colonial power. K.S. Venkateramani published Murugan the Tiller in 1927. It speaks about two people, two young men. One is a Gandhian, another is a materialist. And there is conflict between the two. But finally, we find both of them settling in a Gandhian colony, which indirectly reveals how both of them embraces Gandhism. And from the same novelist, there is another novel, Kandan the Patriot, and its subtitle is A Novel of New Indian in the Making, which was published in 1932. The title is very significant, A Novel of New Indian in the Making. And that refers to the idea that there is a new Indian, there is a new kind of awareness among Indians at this time. And in this novel, we find a civil servant who resigns from civil service and joins the civil disobedience movement. An ICS officer resigning his job and joining the freedom movement. And that is a very important indication of how the youth of that time was influenced by the nationalist movement. So nationalism and the movement for freedom is very much reflected in almost all writings of this particular period. A.S.P. Iyer, who wrote Baladitya, published in 1930, actually refers to an incident in 5th century. But even though he was speaking about a 5th century incident, he was indirectly referring to the freedom movement, because in that novel, Baladitya, he refers to a war in which the natives are defeating a foreign invader, the Huns. So A.S.P. Iyer was indirectly referring to the freedom movement, because he cannot directly speak about the freedom movement. He was a civil servant. So such indirect references to freedom movement was also seen at that time. K. Nagarajan, another important novelist who wrote Athavar House, published in 1937, speaks about a Maharashtrian Brahmin family settled in the south. And he is speaking about the emergence of modernity and how it influences the life of these people. But it is after this, we find in the 1930s that the most important writers who actually ruled the whole century, that is 20th century, emerged, and they are known as the big three, that is Mulk Raj Anand, R.K. Narayan and Raja Rao. These three are known as the big three because they influenced the writers of the 20th century, and they wrote continuously, and their presence was felt throughout the century, and their influence on Indian fiction in English is quite large. They gave a kind of identity for Indian fiction in English, and Indian fiction in English began to be read by people in India as well as outside India because of the influence of these three writers. So they are actually the major writers belonging to the 20th century. Among them, Mulk Raj Anand came out with a fantastic novel, that is Untouchable. Untouchable was published in 1935. We are all familiar with the novel Untouchable. It speaks about the life of Baka, a scavenger, and the writer depicts the pitiable life of Baka. Even though he leads a very sincere life, he does his duty very sincerely, he is ill-treated by the caste Hindus. He is considered to be an untouchable, and he is trying to come out of these traditional control the traditional kind of prejudices against the lower caste. So Untouchable depicts a kind of the problem of identity of the individual. It is believed that the philosophy of existentialism has influenced Anand while writing this novel. So he is trying to depict the existential angst of the untouchable people. Here the Baka, a scavenger. We find that Gandhi also appears as a character in this novel, but Mulkraj Anand does not accept the solution put forward by Gandhi. He was a scientific socialist, and he believes in science more than anything else. He believes in a kind of scientific solution to the problem of caste, and that is reflected in the novel. So Untouchable is important in many ways. One is that it is the first novel that tries to portray the pitiable life of the untouchable lower caste people in India. It is also important because Mulkraj Anand tried to introduce a new style of writing in English by an Indian, a new way of presenting life, a new kind of hero, a new way of portraying life. So it is important in many ways, and there were several studies about Untouchable, including post-colonialist studies, which try to depict how the novel presents the reality of Indian life, social reality of Indian life during that particular period. And Mulkraj Anand continued to write. He is a writer who produces novels year after year. If he published Untouchable in 1935, in 1936 he came out with another important novel, that is Coolie. Coolie, as the title suggests, is a novel that speaks about the ordinary worker, the coolie, the working class people. And then in 1937, the very next year, he came with another important novel, Two Leaves and a Bud. And it is about the plantation workers, And then in 1939, 1941 and 1942, he wrote 3 novels. He published 3 novels. And these 3 novels are connected novels. So they are known as a trilogy, a collection of 3 novels, connected novels. The first one in that series is The Village, published in 1939. Second is Across the Black Waters, published in 1941. Third is The Sword and the Sickle, published in 1942. So this trilogy also depicts the life of the ordinary people. It depicts the life of Lal Singh. Lal Singh is the central figure in this novel, who rebels against the moral codes of the village. But finally he is imprisoned. So we find such social issues of the poor, issues of the working class, issues of the lower caste people presented by Mulkraj Anand in these novels. We will discuss the later novels of Mulkraj Anand when we discuss the post-independence fiction. The Big Heart is another important novel published in 1945, which tries to problematize the confrontation between machine and modernity. R.K. Narayan is another important writer who belongs to this big 3. R.K. Narayan is a writer who is very different from Mulkraj Anand. Narayan writes in a style that is very much grammatical, ordinary English. He doesn't experiment with the language. Even the village men like Valen that he depicts in the novel The Guide speaks properly grammatical English. But his interest is in creating humor. His style is very much humorous in nature. He depicts ordinary middle class life in South India, and he has created an imaginary locale, and that is Malgudi. Malgudi has achieved the status of a real place through the novels written by R.K. Narayan. From novel to novel, Malgudi also transforms. The Malgudi, which was a very small village, transforms into a small town and then a bigger town in novel after novel. And that is a kind of depiction that Narayan does in his novels. And he also wrote several stories connected with Malgudi. We find that Narayan's novels try to address the life of ordinary middle class people. Unlike Mulkraj Anand, he is not much interested in the life of the poor people or the working class, etc. But his focus is on the family life. Swami and Friends, the first major novel written by R.K. Narayan, is about the escapades of a schoolboy, which is highly humorous. The Bachelor of Arts, published in 1937, depicts a rebelling bachelor, Chandran, who doesn't want to marry a woman in a traditional fashion. So he was rebelling against such traditional norms, traditional ways of getting married. And he wanted to, he's arguing for a love marriage. But finally what we find is that he also marries a woman in a traditional fashion. The Dark Room in 1938 is a story of an abortive rebellion of a housewife rebelling against the norms, the kind of practices within the family, the patriarchal norms of the family. Then The English Teacher, published in 1946, is a novel about the laws and reconciliation, and it also depicts certain supernatural experiences. That was written at a time when Narayan was very much disturbed because of the early death of his wife. He lost his wife at an early age, and that is very much depicted in this novel, or the influence of that unhappy experience is there in this novel. So when we speak about R.K. Narayan, we find that Narayan tries to write in a style that is very much ordinary. It is believed that Narayan is influenced by Faulkner, the famous novelist, but the major attraction of his novels is the kind of humor, the underlying humor that is present in his novels. And like Mulkraj Anand, Narayan also had a very long standing as a novelist. And then Raja Rao is another major figure in this group. Raja Rao's Kantapura is the novel that comes before independence. Kantapura is a novel that has historical importance, not because it writes about history, but because it tries to introduce several new trends in Indian writing in English, and that too in 1938 itself. And one important feature of this novel is the use of language. Raja Rao tries to use a kind of English which is different from the English used by the British, or English used by the American, or English used by people in other parts of the world. This is truly Indian English, because he tries to mix Kannada with English. And another important feature of this novel is the kind of narrative style that he uses. He uses the style of Harikatha, a traditional Indian way of storytelling. And in the introduction to this novel, he explains his idea about the use of language. He says his intention is to convey in a language not one's own, the spirit that is one's own. To convey in a language not one's own, the spirit that is one's own. So he makes it clear that he uses English in a different fashion. And we find Raja Rao using many Indian words as it is, especially Kannada words as it is, and several literal translations of Kannada words. Literal translations of Kannada words. For example, we know that in the names of certain people, we also use the name of the family. Family name is also added with the name of a person. And in this novel, Kantapura, there is a character Murthy. And Murthy's name in this novel appears as Corner House Murthy. Corner House Murthy. That is a literal translation of the Kannada name of Murthy and his family name. And another character, Waterfall Vengama. Waterfall Vengama. So such literal translations are used by Raja Rao in this novel. And another thing is that certain expressions that we usually use in Kannada is translated as it is. And when people use abusive terms, you donkey's wife, and such a term is not used in English, but that term that is used in Kannada is translated as it is, donkey's wife, etc. So using such expressions and literal translations, Raja Rao is trying to create a language which is his own, which is Indian. We can say a kind of Indian English, which is different from the English used by any person outside India. And that was his aim, and he succeeds in that. And Kantapura is a story that speaks about an imaginary place, Kantapura, which come under the influence of Gandhi and transforms considerably because of that. Murthy in this character belongs to an upper caste family, but he familiarizes himself with the ordinary lower caste people, and because of that he was thrown out of his caste. And he leads the Gandhian struggle, Gandhian movement in that village. And there is an estate, Skeffington estate nearby, and the workers in that estate also joins him, and there is an agitation, there is arrest, and people are imprisoned. And in the final part of the novel, we find Murthy and others are being released from prison. But when they come to Kantapura, the village has been completely transformed. New people from Bombay has come and settled there, and the old village is not seen. A total transformation is depicted. It has been completely transformed, and that is a kind of scene at the last part of the novel. So anyway, Raja Rao was trying to present the transformation of the village under the influence of the nationalist movement, especially under the influence of Gandhi. So these three novelists, that is Mulk Rajanand, R.K. Narayan and Raja Rao, they began writing in the pre-independence period, and they continued to write in the post-independence period. But some of the major novels of these writers have been written in the pre-independence period itself, and their influence is very much there in the writings of the novelists who came after them. Indian fiction in English began to flourish after independence. As referred before, the big three writers, Mulkraj Anand, R.K. Narayan, and Raja Rao, they continued to publish novels after independence, and along with them, several other writers also began to emerge. And some of the important writers are Ahmad Ali, who wrote Twilight of Delhi, and K. Abbas, who wrote several novels. Some of the popular novels of K. Abbas is Tomorrow is Ours, Inqulab, etc. It is interesting to note that K. Abbas was also a journalist and a script writer. He wrote most of the important scripts to Raj Kapoor films, and he is famous as a script writer as well. And Mulkraj Anand produced several novels, important novels in the post-independence period as well. Private Life of an Indian Prince, 1953. The Old Woman and the Cow, 1960. The Road, 1963. The Death of a Hero, 1964. Morning Face, 1970. Confessions of a Lover, 1976. These are some of the important novels that he wrote. So, Mulkraj Anand was a prolific writer, and similar is the case of R.K. Narayan. R.K. Narayan produced Mr. Sambat, 1949, Financial Expert, 1952, Waiting for the Mahatma, 1955, The Guide, 1958, The Man-Eater of Malgudi, 1962, The Vendor of Sweets, 1967, The Painter of Science, 1976, A Tiger for Malgudi, 1983, The Talkative Man, 1986, The World of Nagaraj, 1990, etc. So, R.K. Narayan actually developed as a writer in the post-independence period. He began to experiment with his narrative. Even though he never experimented with the language, his narrative techniques were very interesting. For example, in the novel The Guide, which is extremely popular, which has been converted into a film, a Hindi film, The Guide, is one novel where he experiments with the narrative, because it is a double narrative. Two narrators are there, and it tries to depict the viewpoints of different people. We know that in the postmodern novels we find such experiments. Different narrators are used, and the viewpoints of multiple characters are presented in the postmodern novel. And in Guide, actually R.K. Narayan tries to present a similar kind of technique, even though not the same. And we find that Raju is the central figure in that novel, who was an ordinary guide, that is a tourist guide. And the several incidents happen in his life. He has an association with a woman, a wife of another person, that is Nalini, and he supports Nalini because Nalini wanted to become a dancer. Her husband doesn't allow her, but Raju supports her, and through that there is a breakup in that marriage, and Raju slowly began to live with Nalini, and because of a fraudulent activity on his part, he was imprisoned, he was arrested and imprisoned, and he was jailed for some time. And while in jail, he undergoes a transformation. He becomes a very sincere person and does all his duties properly in the jail, and he was released. After he was released, he becomes a sannyasi, and that too through a very unexpected incident. A villager comes and sees this person who is sitting under a tree looking like a sannyasi. So he mistakes him to be a sannyasi and asks for help. And Raju speaks in a disconnected fashion, so he was mistaken to be a sannyasi. Anyway, in that novel we find that there is an omniscient narrator and Raju as narrator. Raju is one of the narrators and there is an omniscient narrator. And these two narratives crisscross in the novel, and that is used very efficiently and effectively by the writer. And the guide is a very good example of how R.K. Narayan experiments with the narrative. And it is a novel that also speaks about the kind of contemporary ignorance and superstition of the Indian people, Indian villagers or Indian people, both educated and uneducated. So it is a kind of a humorous presentation of Indian life, and he is actually criticizing our inability to see the reality. What is real, what is actual is often forgotten. We most often run after false issues. We are always after false issues, whereas the real issues are forgotten. So it is a kind of a criticism of contemporary Indian life. And after this big three, sorry, I didn't refer to Raja Rao. So Raja Rao also produced several novels, but he is not so prolific as the other two. He published The Serpent and the Rope, one of the most famous novels written by him in 1960, The Cat and Shakespeare in 1965, Comrade Kirillov published in 1976, The Chess Master and His Moves 1988. These are some of the novels, important novels written by him. Apart from these big three novelists, we find several other novelists emerging. So Indian writing in English began to gain momentum during this period after independence. We may think that with the departure of the colonial rulers, the British colonialists, people may lose interest in English, especially in Indian English writing. But what happened was just the opposite. People began to gain more interest in writing in English as well as reading the writings in English. And that is why we find the emergence of numerous writers from different parts of India emerging during this period. Bhabani Bhattacharya is one among them, who published novels that depict the Indian life, the Indian poverty, the life of the ordinary people. He writes in a realistic style, and his writings are to a certain extent similar to that of Mulk Raj Anand, because he also focuses on the life of ordinary people. So Many Hungers, published in 1947, depicts the sorry plight of the poor people during Bengal famine. Music for Mohini was published in 1952. He Who Rides the Tiger, 1952. Goddess Named Gold, Shadow from Ladakh, Dreams in Hawaii are some of the other novels. And similar is the case of Manohar Malgunkar, another important novelist. Distant Drum is the first novel written by him, 1960, and Combat of Shadows, 1962, etc. And Khushwant Singh is another popular writer. He was a journalist. He was the editor of the Illustrated Weekly for some time. Anyway, he is also famous as a novelist. Train to Pakistan, published in 1956, is one of the most popular novels written by Khushwant Singh. G.V. Desani is another writer. All About H. Hatter is one important novel written by him. Atia Hussain, Sunlight on the Broken Column, is a novel written by her. And Kamala Markandeya, Nainthara Sagar. So we find the emergence of several women writers also. Kamala Markandeya is a writer who published several novels. A Handful of Rice is one famous novel written by her. Nectar in a Sieve is another novel. She also tries to depict the life of the poor people, especially in the cities. So her novels are focusing on the city poor poor people living in the city. Nainthara Sagar is another woman writer like Kamala Markandeya, and Nainthara Sagar is a political writer, and her novels tries to focus on the growth of Indian life or Indian political history, and the political history is traced from novel after novel by Nainthara Sagar, beginning from the pre-independence period to the emergency. Rich Like Us is a novel that presents the experience of emergency, and A Day in Shadow is a novel that presents the personal life of a woman and how she is being ill-treated by her husband, and it is considered to be to a certain extent biographical in nature. And Mistaken Identity is a novel that depicts how the Indian politics is changing, how fundamentalism, communal politics emerges in the Indian situation. So Nainthara Sagar belongs to a highly politicized family because she is the daughter of Vijayalakshmi Pandit, the sister of Jawaharlal Nehru, and even though she belongs to the Nehru family, she is highly critical of Indira Gandhi and her style of politics, especially the emergency. And so Nainthara Sagar is distinctive in the sense that her novels are all highly political in nature. And Anita Desai is another famous writer, Clear Light of Day. Arun Joshi is another writer, and we find the emergence of lot of women writers as well as young Indian writers in English during this period. So the post-independence period witnessed the growth of Indian fiction in English, and it spread to almost all parts of India. Writers belonging to all over India began to write novels in English during this period. But it is with the emergence of Salman Rushdie that Indian fiction in English got a different turn. We can say a kind of postmodern turn. Salman Rushdie's novel Midnight's Children created a kind of revolution in Indian writing in English, because Midnight's Children got Booker Prize for literature. Not only that, it is a novel that introduced several new trends in Indian fiction in English. One is that this particular novel deviated from the nationalistic themes, the kind of concerns that the earlier writers tried to depict. In Midnight Children, there is a specific attempt to criticize the nation. There is a particular kind of attempt to destabilize the kind of narrative style that was used by the earlier writers. He uses a kind of language that is different from the earlier writers. We find that he uses a kind of English which is a mixture of Bombay Hindi and English. It is known as a chutnified language. Bombay Hindi is mixed with English. We know that Raja Rao actually made such an experiment in Kantapura. That is true. But that experiment was carried forward in a highly different fashion by Salman Rushdie in Midnight's Children. Moreover, the narrative style is considered to be that of a kind of magical realism, and it is disconnected. So a kind of postmodern technique is used by Rushdie in his novel. So Midnight's Children is considered to be a landmark, a turning point in Indian fiction in English. And there is a kind of celebration of hybridity rather than oneness. the oneness of the nation, unity of the nation is questioned, and there is a celebration of hybridity and a rejection of purity and unity and the kind of idea of cultural oneness. So with the emergence of Rushdie and Midnight's Children, Indian fiction in English began to transform further. Moreover, another transformation is that Indian writers began to be noticed by foreigners. Indian fiction in English began to get acceptance outside India in a great extent. We know that Mulk Raja Anand, R.K. Narayan, Raja Ravu were also accepted outside India, but in a larger scale, Indian writers began to be accepted outside India. So, following Salman Rushdie emerged a lot of new writers, young writers like Amitav Ghosh, Shashi Tharoor, Ubhamanyu Chatterjee, Vikram Seth, Mughal Kesavan, Manju Kabur, Arundhati Roy, etc. So these contemporary writers, we can say, they all experimented with the language, they experimented with the style of writing, and they all started writing a kind of fiction that attempts to problematize the nation, problematize the kind of Indian culture, and they also tried to project a kind of decentered and disconnected life through their disconnected narratives. Even though these writers wrote in entirely different styles, we find that there is a kind of common feature, that is their rebellion against the existing system. Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things was another Booker Prize winning novel, and we find Arundhati Roy trying to experiment with the narrative. Here Arundhati Roy is using a kind of English which is a mixture of Malayalam and English. So a lot of experimentation happened during this period, and Indian fiction in English began to be accepted by readers all over the world. So a big market, a huge market was opened before Indian fiction writers, and there is a kind of huge transformation that happened during this period. There was a time when people thought that nobody will be interested in a writing by an Indian in English, because English is not our language. How can we write in English just as an Englishman writes or an American writes, because it is an alien language for us. But a time has come when all over the world readers began to get interest in Indians writing in English, and most of these writers live outside India. Some of them live in both India as well as outside, and they try to write about themes that are transnational also. All these novels are not happening within India, they happen in different countries. So such a kind of transnational existence is there for the new writers or contemporary writers of Indian English. So I didn't refer to all the writers, all the important writers during this period. My attempt was only to give you an idea about how Indian fiction in English emerged and developed and continues in the contemporary period. We find that Indian fiction in English began in the 19th century. It got a different turn in the early part of 20th century under the influence of nationalist movement and Mahatma Gandhi. And then in the post-independence period, again there is a shift in the themes, and in the 1980s and after, there is again another kind of transformation that happened to Indian fiction in English. So, the Indian fiction in English, which began with a kind of imitative mentality, imitation of the West, gained an identity of its own slowly after independence, or even before independence in the 1930s, and after independence this kind of originality, original kind of writing emerged in huge numbers, and now we can be proud of the fact that we have an Indian writing in English, Indian fiction in English, which is different from the writings or the novels that are written by people belonging to other countries, other nations. So, thank you very much for listening.